Day 1. He is 18 years old. He has never fired a weapon at a human being. He has never watched someone die in front of him. He has never had to decide, in a fraction of a second, whether the person running toward him is a threat or a father looking for his child. He is, by every meaningful measure, a normal young man. 18 months later, he can do all of those things without flinching. The United States military took a teenager who would have struggled to kill a spider and turned him into someone who could end a human life on command. They did it deliberately, systematically, scientifically, and they did it in less than 2 years. Here is the question no one asks: how? And more importantly, what happens to the person when the killing stops? The question you've been carrying. If you've been watching this channel, you already know something most people don't. You know that ordinary people commit extraordinary violence. You know that the brain changes under sustained stress. You know that the soldier who comes home is not the same person who left. But there's a gap in that story, a gap that has been bothering you even if you couldn't name it. We've talked about what war does to the human mind. We've talked about what happens when soldiers come home. We've talked about the invisible wounds they carry. But we haven't asked the most fundamental question of all. Who taught them to carry those wounds in the first place? Who decided that a human being, with all the natural resistance, empathy, and moral instinct that evolution gave them, needed to be rewired? Who designed the process? And did they ever stop to ask, what are we building and can we ever take it apart? The question is what this video is about. Because the answer changes everything you think you know about war, about soldiers, and about the society that sends them. The man who studied killing. His name was Dave Grossman. He was a lieutenant colonel in the US Army, a psychology professor at West Point, and a man who spent years thinking about something most people spend their entire lives avoiding: the act of killing. Not the politics of it, not the strategy, the act itself. What it does to the person who performs it, what it costs, what it requires. In 1995, Grossman published a book called On Killing. It would go on to become required reading at military academies around the world. It would be cited in congressional hearings, criminology courses, and psychological research. It would make Grossman famous and deeply controversial in equal measure. The central argument of the book was deceptively simple. Human beings have a profound, innate resistance to killing other human beings. Not a reluctance, not a hesitation, a resistance, a deep, biological, almost reflexive opposition to taking the life of their own species. And Grossman had the data to prove it. During World War II, US Army Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall conducted extensive interviews with soldiers on the front lines. His finding was astonishing. In any given firefight, only 15 to 20% of combat soldiers actually fired their weapons at the enemy. Not 50%, not 70%. 15 to 20, the rest, the majority, fired into the air, into the ground, or did not fire at all. Even in the middle of a war. Even with their own lives at risk. Even when their training told them to shoot. They couldn't. The human mind, face to face with another human being, refused. To understand why, you have to understand something about how the brain processes faces. When you look into another person's eyes, even a stranger, even someone you've been told is your enemy, a complex cascade of neural activity unfolds. Mirror neurons fire. The empathy network activates. The brain begins, automatically and unconsciously, to model that person's inner state. To feel in some small way what they might be feeling. This is not a choice, it is not a value. It is a neurological function built into the architecture of the human brain over millions of years of social evolution. We are, at the most fundamental level, wired to recognize each other. This recognition is the foundation of empathy, and empathy, as we've discussed in previous videos, is one of the most powerful inhibitors of violence. You can be furious at someone and still not be able to hurt them once you're close enough to see their face clearly. Grossman found evidence of this pattern throughout military history. Soldiers in ancient battles, where combat was hand-to-hand, face-to-face, frequently reported that they could not deliver the killing blow, even when the enemy was helpless. Roman accounts, medieval chronicles, and Civil War diaries all describe the same phenomenon. Men who fought ferociously until the moment of final violence, and then found themselves unable to cross that last threshold. The gun changed the mathematics of war. Distance made killing easier, but it didn't solve the problem. Even with rifles, even with artillery, even with bombs dropped from the sky, the resistance persisted. Because even at a distance, the human brain knew what it was doing. And it resisted. The military had a choice. Accept this resistance, or break it. They chose to break it. By the time of the Vietnam War, the US military had studied Marshall's findings and drawn a conclusion. The 15 to 20% firing rate was unacceptable. They needed soldiers who would shoot, and so they hired psychologists, behavioral scientists, and conditioning experts to redesign basic training from the ground up. What they created was one of the most sophisticated behavior modification programs in human history. It worked on 3 levels simultaneously: the body, the mind, and the identity. By the time of Vietnam, the firing rate had risen to 95%. That number did not happen by accident. It was engineered. Here is how they did it. Step 1. Desensitization. The first obstacle was emotional. The recruits arrived with the same empathy, the same inhibitions, the same biological resistance to killing that all human beings carry. The training had to erode that resistance without destroying the recruits' capacity to function. The primary tool was desensitization, gradual, systematic exposure to violence until the emotional response diminished. It began with language. The enemy was never a person. He was a target, a body, a contact. The vocabulary of killing was stripped of its human content before the killing itself began. In previous videos, we talked about dehumanization as a feature of war propaganda. But in military training, it was something more deliberate, not spontaneous, designed. Recruits were taught to use dehumanizing language as a matter of routine, not because their commanders believed the enemy was subhuman, but because they knew that if the enemy remained fully human in the soldier's mind, the soldier would hesitate at the critical moment, and hesitation got people killed. Alongside language, training introduced graphic imagery, photographs of combat injuries, footage of real violence, simulated carnage in training environments. The goal was to reduce the shock response, to make the mind familiar with what it would face. Psychologists call this systematic desensitization. It is the same technique used to treat phobias, except in reverse. Instead of helping the brain become comfortable with something harmless, it was training the brain to become comfortable with something devastating. It worked. After sustained exposure, recruits reported lower anxiety responses to violent imagery. Their heart rates spiked less. Their startle responses diminished. They were becoming accustomed to a world where violence was normal. Step 2. Classical and operant conditioning. The second level of conditioning worked below the level of conscious thought. Grossman identified the central mechanism. The military replaced the human target in shooting practice with human-shaped silhouettes that popped up, required an immediate response, and disappeared. When the soldier hit the target, there was immediate positive reinforcement, praise, advancement, status within the unit. This was not accidental. It was a direct application of Pavlovian and Skinnerian conditioning applied to the act of killing. The brain was being trained at a reflexive level to associate a human-shaped form with the automatic motor response of pulling the trigger. No time for thought, no space for hesitation. The silhouette appears, the finger moves, the brain learns. This is what we do. Repeat this 10,000 times. The result is not a soldier who decides to shoot. It is a soldier who shoots before deciding and makes sense of it afterward. This is a crucial distinction. It means that in the field, under stress, with a human being in front of them, the conditioned response activates faster than the moral evaluation can even begin. The body moves, the mind catches up, and by the time the mind arrives, the act is done. Step 3. The dissolution of individual identity. The third and deepest layer of conditioning targeted identity itself. A human being with a strong individual identity, a self, a history, a set of personal values, is difficult to turn into a weapon. Because that identity will resist, it will raise objections, it will notice when what is being asked conflicts with who the person believes themselves to be. So the training began by dismantling that identity. The head is shaved, the civilian clothes are taken away. A number is assigned. The personal history, the family, the hometown, the individual story is temporarily irrelevant. In its place, a new identity is constructed. The soldier, not a person who serves in the military. An identity, a way of being, a complete reorientation of the self around the values of the unit. Loyalty, obedience, strength, mission. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, which we discussed in an earlier video, demonstrated how powerfully a role can override individual personality. Will become who they are told they are. Given a uniform and authority, ordinary college students became something they would have been incapable of imagining before the experiment began. Military training understood this truth long before Zimbardo put it in a laboratory. The new identity was not cruel, it was not mindless. It was purposeful, disciplined, and in many ways, admirable. Soldiers became genuinely better in certain ways, more resilient, more capable, more deeply bonded to the people beside them. But the identity also carried something else. A capacity for violence that the previous self did not have. And a set of triggers, language, imagery, contexts that could activate that capacity at speed. The science they built it on. Grossman's work gave a name to something the military had been doing empirically for decades: killology, the scientific study of the act of killing and the psychological conditions that enable or prevent it. It was not a popular word. Critics accused Grossman of glorifying violence, of reducing human life to a problem of operational efficiency. The academic establishment was uncomfortable with the premise that killing could be studied the way any other behavior could be studied, optimized, trained. But the military was not interested in comfort. It was interested in effectiveness. And the research, uncomfortable as it was, kept pointing in the same direction. The psychologist B.F. Skinner had demonstrated, decades earlier, that virtually any behavior in any organism could be conditioned through the strategic application of reinforcement and punishment. Rats could be trained to navigate mazes. Pigeons could be trained to guide missiles. Skinner actually proposed this during World War II in a project called Project Pigeon. The military was not horrified. They were interested. The question was never whether human behavior could be conditioned. The question was what, specifically, needed to be conditioned, and how. Grossman identified the key variables. The soldier needed to be desensitized to the sight of human suffering, needed to have the act of shooting a human-shaped target become automatic rather than deliberate, needed to have their individual moral identity temporarily subsumed into the collective identity of the unit, and needed to believe, at a gut level, not just intellectually, that the people they were killing deserved it. All four of these conditions could be engineered. All four were engineered. What Grossman did not address with equal rigor, what the military did not address with equal rigor, was the question of reversal. If you can condition a behavior in, can you condition it out? The answer, as it turns out, is yes, but it requires sustained effort, specialized technique, a safe environment, and time. Significant time. The military has, historically, provided almost none of these things to the soldiers it processes out of service. The average transition from active duty to civilian life in the United States takes roughly 4 days of mandatory transition assistance programming. 4 days. To undo what took 18 months to build, the math does not add up. And the people living inside that math are paying for it with their lives. Vietnam, where the gap became visible. Before Vietnam, American society had a framework for veterans, however imperfect. World War II had produced a generation of men who had seen terrible things, who carried their wounds quietly, who were not offered therapy or transition services, but who returned to a society that celebrated them, integrated them, gave them the GI Bill and suburban houses, and a cultural narrative in which their suffering had a clear meaning. They were heroes. The story made sense. The cost could be endured because the purpose was legible. Vietnam was different. The soldiers came home from a war the country didn't believe in, to a society that was not sure whether to greet them as heroes or hold them responsible for atrocities that had been broadcast on television. Some were spat on. Most were simply ignored. The welcome home that the conditioning had not provided, the ritual, the acknowledgement, the collective witness, was replaced with silence, suspicion, or hostility. And the soldiers were left alone with nervous systems that had been precision-engineered for violence, in a society that had no use for what they had become. The results were catastrophic and well documented. Vietnam veterans suffered PTSD at rates the VA was not equipped to handle, because the VA barely recognized PTSD as a diagnosis until 1980, nearly a decade after the last combat troops came home. Addiction rates were enormous. Divorce rates were enormous. Incarceration rates among Vietnam veterans were, and remain, significantly higher than the general population. Karl Marlantes, a Vietnam veteran and author, described what it felt like to return in a single image that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said it was like being handed a live grenade and told to go home and figure out what to do with it yourself. The grenade was everything the war had put inside him, the training, the violence, the deaths he had caused and witnessed, the person he had been required to become in order to survive. The grenade was real. It was in his hands, and nobody, not the military, not the government, not the society that had sent him, seemed to think it was their problem. He spent years learning, slowly, painstakingly, how to set it down. Many of his generation never did. The lessons of Vietnam were not fully absorbed. The conditioning programs were refined, but not reversed. The transition support improved marginally. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan produced a new generation carrying the same weight, with marginally better tools and the same fundamental absence of a real answer to the same fundamental question. You took them apart. Now put them back together. How? The numbers that changed everything. The results of this redesigned training were measurable and dramatic. In World War II, as Marshall recorded, the firing rate among infantry was 15 to 20%. In Korea, it had risen to approximately 55%. In Vietnam, the first war fought by soldiers trained under the new conditioning protocols, it reached 90 to 95%. By any military metric, this was an extraordinary success. But there was something the success metrics didn't capture. Vietnam veterans returned home with PTSD rates that the country had never seen before. The suicide rate among veterans climbed. Drug use exploded. Homelessness among veterans became a national crisis. The military had successfully trained men to overcome their resistance to killing, and then sent them back into a society that had no mechanism, no ritual, no language, no institutional framework to help them undo what had been done. Because here is the thing about conditioning, it works in both directions. You can condition a behavior in, but conditioning it out is a different problem entirely. And the military, for most of its history, had not tried. The story of a sniper. There is a veteran, we will call him Thomas, who served 2 tours in Iraq as a designated marksman. His job, defined precisely and without euphemism, was to find human beings at long distance and kill them. He was good at it. His training had made him good at it. His brain had been conditioned to treat the human form in his scope as a target, to suppress empathic recognition. This made the act nearly impossible, and to complete the mission. He came home with a chest full of commendations. He also came home with something else. He described it as a kind of doubling. 2 selves occupying the same body. The Thomas who ate breakfast with his wife and drove his son to school. And the other Thomas, the one who had lived in that scope for 2 years, who was always present, always watching, always evaluating the distance between himself and every person in the room. I can't turn it off, he said. I don't know how, nobody taught me how. His wife noticed it first in small things. He always sat with his back to the wall in restaurants. He would tense up when someone walked too quickly toward them from behind. He couldn't watch movies with gunfire without leaving the room. I know it's a movie, he said. The body doesn't. Thomas eventually found his way to a therapist who specialized in veterans. It took 3 years of weekly sessions before he described his first significant moment of relief. Not healing, relief. A reduction in the constant background hum of readiness. 3 years. The military had conditioned him in 18 months. It took 3 years of intensive therapy just to begin to walk it back, and he was one of the lucky ones. He found the therapist. He asked for help. He had a wife who stayed. Most don't have all three. What the research says. The psychological literature on post-combat adjustment has identified a consistent pattern. The same mechanisms that make soldiers effective in combat create vulnerabilities in civilian life. Hypervigilance, the constant environmental scanning that kept them alive in the field, becomes anxiety disorder at home. The hair-trigger stress response that allowed for split-second decisions becomes an inability to tolerate ordinary frustration. The emotional suppression that prevented breakdown under fire becomes the numbing and disconnection that destroys relationships. The brain was rewired for an environment that no longer exists, and the rewiring doesn't come with an undo function. Neuroscientist Rachel Yehuda's research on trauma and memory has shown that traumatic conditioning can produce measurable epigenetic changes, alterations in how genes are expressed, affecting not just the individual, but potentially their children. The biology of extreme conditioning runs deeper than behavior. It runs into the cellular architecture of the person. Jonathan Shea, who spent decades treating Vietnam veterans, described what he witnessed as the destruction of character. Not just psychological symptoms, the corruption of the person's fundamental moral and emotional capacities. The internal structures that made them who they were before, degraded by what they were asked to do and become. We took them at their best, Shea wrote, and returned them damaged. That sentence should stop everyone who sends a young person to war from sleeping. The question the system never asked. Here is what is remarkable about the military's conditioning program, viewed from a distance. It was built by extraordinarily intelligent people, drawing on the best available science with a clear and measurable goal: increase the percentage of soldiers who would fire their weapons in combat. They achieved that goal completely. But they appear never to have asked a second question. What happens afterward? What do we do with a human being whose capacity for lethal violence we have deliberately amplified? Whose inhibitions we have systematically dismantled? Once the war is over, the answer, for most of American military history, was nothing in particular. Thank you for your service. Here is your discharge paperwork. Goodbye. This is not a condemnation of individuals. The generals and trainers and psychologists who designed these systems were not malicious. They were solving the problem in front of them. And the problem in front of them was, how do we keep our soldiers alive and give them the tools to win? They solved it. They just never asked, and then what? The military builds the weapon. It does not build the peace that follows. The cost that doesn't appear on any budget. There is a calculation that the United States government makes every time it goes to war. It is called the cost of war. It includes weapons, logistics, personnel, intelligence, reconstruction. It is measured in trillions. It does not include the full cost of what happens to the people who fight it. A 2021 study by the Watson Institute at Brown University estimated that the cost of long-term care for veterans of the post-9/11 wars, including health care, disability payments, and mental health services, will exceed $2 trillion over the coming decades. And that estimate, the researchers noted, is almost certainly conservative, because the psychological costs of these wars are still unfolding. Children who grew up with traumatized veterans are now adults. Some of them are struggling in ways that may never be connected, in any official accounting, to a war their parent fought before they were born. The conditioning that began in a basic training facility in 2003 is still producing consequences in 2026. It will still be producing consequences in 2040. This is the nature of what was built. It is not a structure that can be demolished. It is a biological and psychological change in real human beings, propagating through families and communities across time. The military engineer who designed the conditioning protocol has long since retired. The government that authorized the war has moved on to other things. The public that watched the troop deployments on television has largely forgotten. But the 18-year-old who raised his right hand is still living with what was built inside him. And the question of who is responsible for that, not legally, not politically, but morally, is one that a society which chooses to wage war cannot afford to keep ignoring. Because every time it sends another generation of 18-year-olds through the same process. Without building the institutions and rituals and sustained support systems to bring them back, it is making the same choice again. It is choosing to build the weapon and declining to think about what happens when the war is over. The ritual that was never created. In almost every traditional warrior culture throughout history, there were rituals designed specifically for returning fighters. Not victory parades, not medals, rituals of transition, ceremonies that acknowledged, explicitly and communally, that the person who had gone to war had crossed a threshold, had done things and seen things and become something that the ordinary world had no framework for, and that returning to ordinary life required a passage, a transformation, a deliberate re-entry. The Navajo Nation had a ceremony called the Enemy Way, a multi-day ritual designed to help warriors shed the spiritual weight of what they had carried in combat and re-enter the community as themselves, not as warriors. Ancient Greek city-states had purification rites for soldiers returning from battle. Even medieval, chivalric codes included formal processes for the psychological and moral transition from war to peace. These rituals existed because these cultures understood something that modern military bureaucracy has largely forgotten. You cannot take a person to the edge of what it means to be human and bring them back without acknowledging what happened. Without ceremony, without witness, without the community saying, "We know where you've been, we know what we asked, we see you." The United States military discharges approximately 200,000 service members every year. Most of them receive a few days of transition assistance, resume workshops, VA benefits briefings, a handshake. Then, they are alone, with everything they were built to do, and no instruction manual for what comes next, the inheritance. There is one more dimension of this story that almost no one talks about. We have discussed, in previous videos, the research on epigenetic transmission of trauma, the evidence that the physiological signatures of extreme stress can be passed from parents to children through biological mechanisms that science is only beginning to understand. But there is another kind of inheritance, a cultural one. When veterans come home changed, and the society that sent them has no framework for what they've become, the damage doesn't stay contained. It spreads into families, into children who grow up with fathers who flinch at loud sounds and cannot be touched from behind, into mothers who learn to read the silence as danger, into marriages that collapse under the weight of what cannot be said. The military conditioned one generation. The conditioning echoes through the next. A 2021 study found that children of veterans with untreated PTSD showed significantly elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and behavioral dysregulation compared to their peers. Not because trauma is contagious in any simple sense, but because children learn to live in the emotional environment their parents create. They adapt to hypervigilance. They adapt to emotional unavailability. They adapt to the world as their father or mother experienced it, a place of invisible threats and sudden danger. The war ends. The family lives in its aftermath for decades. The society that sent the soldier pays for the ticker tape parade and then moves on. The question that remains open. He's 18 years old. He signed his name on a form. He raised his right hand. And a system, sophisticated, scientific, deliberately designed, went to work on him. By the end of it, he could do things the boy who signed that form could never have imagined. The question I want to leave you with is not whether this was right or wrong. That is a political question, and this channel is not about politics. The question I want to leave you with is simpler and harder. When you build something, you are responsible for what you built. The military built a generation of men and women with rewired nervous systems, dismantled inhibitions, and conditioned responses that civilian life was never designed to accommodate. And then asked those men and women to become accountants, fathers, neighbors, people who wait patiently in line at the grocery store. Every single day in America, the gap between what those people were built to do and what ordinary life requires them to do is the space where something breaks. 17 to 22 of them, every day, lose that fight. And the question that no one in power seems to be asking, the question that this channel has been circling for 5 videos now, is the same question. We knew how to train them. Why didn't we build anything to bring them back? Or maybe the real question is darker than that. Did we ever intend to? If this video made you think differently about what we ask of the people we send to war, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The conversation this country needs to have about its veterans isn't happening in Congress. It's happening in comment sections, in living rooms, in the quiet moments after a video like this one ends. Tell me in the comments, do you think the military has a responsibility to deprogram what it programs? Or is that an impossible ask? There is no right answer, but the question matters. And if you've made it this far, if this series has been doing something for you, subscribe, because we're not finished. What comes next is the question underneath all of these questions. Not what war does to the person who fights it, but what it does to the society that watches. That video is coming. Don't miss it.